Something powerful had been stirring in the church world, and right at the center of it stood Pastor Tolan Morgan. His message, I'm building and fighting, had quickly become the talk of 2025. But this wasn't just another Sunday sermon. It felt more like a declaration of spiritual war, a message that carried fire, pain, and purpose all at once. The moment he stepped onto that pulpit, people could sense something different. The atmosphere was thick, his voice had weight, and his words cut through the silence like thunder. You won't believe how intense it became as he began to speak, not as a preacher, but as a man who had walked through storms and survived. He opened by saying, "You can't stop building just because the battle gets hard." That single line shook the crowd. People jumped to their feet, shouting, clapping, crying. But let me tell you, behind that power was a quiet truth. Pastor Morgan wasn't just preaching about building. He was preaching from building. His own life seemed to echo the very message he was delivering. Every word carried a story. Every pause carried a wound. And this is where it gets interesting. Many people online began to wonder if this sermon was more than spiritual encouragement. Some whispered that it was a reflection of his personal struggle, a hidden battle he had been facing in silence. The sermon itself had been inspired by the story of Nehemiah, the man who rebuilt the broken walls of Jerusalem while enemies surrounded him. Pastor Morgan spoke about building with one hand and fighting with the other, reminding people that progress never came without opposition. The way he said it, the conviction in his voice, it felt like he wasn't talking about history, he was talking about himself. The craziest part was that while he preached about defending what God had given, it sounded like he was describing his own journey, a man holding his dream in one hand and his faith in the other, refusing to let go of either. Social media exploded the same night. Clips of the sermon started spreading everywhere. People called it the most prophetic message of the year. But here's the shocking part. Others believed he was indirectly addressing something deeper, something happening behind the scenes in his own ministry. They said his tone was different this time, heavier, bolder, even emotional at moments where he usually stayed composed. What makes this story different? It wasn't just about a preacher delivering a message. It was about a man pouring his real battle into every word. And destiny took an unexpected turn when even people outside his congregation started tuning in, saying this wasn't just a message, it was a movement. From that day forward, conversations began everywhere. What was happening behind that pulpit? Why did the message feel so personal, almost prophetic? Some said God was speaking through him to prepare the church for the storms ahead. Others thought it was his way of fighting back against unseen critics who had tried to pull him down. But this is how things started to unfold, slowly and with layers of meaning that only became clear as time went on. Pastor Morgan's message became a mirror, reflecting both the strength and the struggle, every believer trying to rebuild while under attack. By the end of that night, the world wasn't just talking about a sermon. They were talking about a man, a leader who seemed to be standing in the middle of a battlefield, hammer in one hand and sword in the other, daring the enemy to stop him. It was powerful, emotional, and deeply human. But little did anyone know this was just the beginning. The days that followed Pastor Tolan Morgan's sermon were nothing short of explosive. What began as a spiritual message soon turned into a storm of opinions, praise, and controversy. People couldn't stop talking. And you won't believe how divided the reactions became. Supporters called the sermon a divine warning, saying it carried a message straight from heaven for believers entering a season of rebuilding. But critics weren't so kind. They began digging deeper, claiming there was something more personal behind his words. Let me tell you, whispers started floating across social media, rumors that Pastor Morgan wasn't just preaching about spiritual battles, he was living through one. Every quote from "I'm building and fighting" was replayed analyzed, and sometimes twisted. Lines like "you build with one hand and defend with the other" became the center of online debates. Some called it the cry of a tired leader. Others said it was the roar of a warrior who refused to fall. And this is where it gets interesting. Even people who had never watched him before were now tuning in, trying to figure out what made this message so magnetic. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the man who said them. What was he really fighting? Who or what was trying to tear down what he had built? But here's the shocking part. Pastor Morgan never said a single word about the rumors. Not one. No public response, no denial, no clarification. Instead, he did what he had always done. He preached again. That silence only added more mystery, because what makes this story different is that he didn't need to defend himself with statements. He defended himself with sermons. Each new message felt like a continuation of the same battle cry. The more people speculated, the stronger his voice became from the pulpit. And the craziest part, every time he preached, it was as if he grew more intense, more personal, more powerful. Behind the applause and the headlines, something deeper seemed to be happening. Those close to the church began noticing how Pastor Morgan carried himself differently. He looked more focused, but also more burdened. His eyes told the story of a man fighting battles most couldn't see. Members of his congregation said there was a weight in the atmosphere, something spiritual, something heavy. It wasn't fear, it was urgency. Destiny took an unexpected turn here, because what started as a sermon began turning into a movement of spiritual awakening. Churches across the country began echoing his message. Other pastors quoted him, saying they too were building and fighting. It was as if his words had unlocked something that believers everywhere were feeling: the tension between progress and pressure, between purpose and pain. Yet, behind this powerful wave, the whispers never stopped. Some claimed that Pastor Morgan's message hinted at internal struggles within his own ministry. A few even suggested that the phrase "building and fighting" was symbolic, a hidden reference to challenges he faced among leadership or even personal loss. None of this was confirmed, but the silence made people believe it even more. Still, he stood tall, unshaken. And that's the thing, this was a man who had learned to speak through storms. What many didn't realize was that Pastor Morgan's story wasn't just about victory, it was about vulnerability. Every sermon, every word carried the weight of a man who had seen both success and suffering. And that's why this message hit so deep, because it wasn't polished or pretty, it was real. He was speaking to anyone who had ever tried to move forward while being pushed back, anyone who had ever fought battles in silence while keeping a smile in public. By the time the second week came, the entire Christian community was divided. Some called him a prophet. Others accused him of hiding something. But one thing was clear: nobody could ignore him. This is how powerful moments begin, not with peace, but with pressure. And Pastor Morgan had just stepped into one of the most defining seasons of his life. As the weeks went by, Pastor Tolan Morgan's words refused to fade away. Instead, they grew louder, not through repetition, but through revelation. People started saying this wasn't just a sermon, it was a prophecy unfolding in real time. His message, "I'm building and fighting," had taken on a life of its own. You won't believe how many people began to relate their own struggles to it. Business owners, pastors, parents, and even young believers were sharing stories online, saying Morgan's words gave them the strength to rebuild their lives while facing invisible battles. But let me tell you, while the world was inspired, something deeper seemed to be happening behind the scenes. Something that made this story far more complex than anyone expected. This is where it gets interesting. Those who followed Pastor Morgan closely began noticing small shifts. His tone in recent messages had changed. It was softer in moments, but somehow heavier with meaning. Gone were the days of lighthearted sermons filled with energy and laughter. What replaced them was fire wrapped in honesty. He wasn't just preaching faith anymore. He was preaching survival. People said it felt like hearing the diary of a man who had walked through darkness and come out with wisdom in his hands. But here's the shocking part. Insiders claim that during this very season, Pastor Morgan had been facing some of the toughest moments of his ministry career. Burnout, leadership transitions, and spiritual fatigue had reportedly taken their toll. Some even whispered that this was his breaking point, and that's what made the sermon so raw. What makes this story different? It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about standing in front of the world, bleeding, but still believing. The craziest part was how Pastor Morgan transformed his personal pain into public purpose. Every time he spoke, it felt like his spirit was both wounded and strengthened at once. And destiny took an unexpected turn when those who had once doubted him began admitting that his honesty made them see him in a new light. People no longer viewed him as just a preacher. They saw a fighter, a man who refused to quit even when the weight of ministry tried to crush him. In one of his follow-up sermons, he said something that silenced the crowd. Exhaustion itself is a weapon the enemy uses to stop you from finishing. What God started in your life, you could hear a pin drop. Those words didn't just sound powerful, they sounded personal. He was describing the silent war that so many leaders face, smiling on Sunday while breaking inside during the week. And that's when people began to understand that I'm building and fighting wasn't just about faith, it was about resilience. Social media started calling him the preacher of perseverance. Hashtags trended, clips went viral, and yet, through all the attention, Pastor Morgan remained humble, quiet, almost cautious. He didn't chase headlines or respond to praise. Instead, he kept doing what he always did, teaching, serving, building. But to those who paid attention, something was clear. The message was slowly becoming his mission. He was teaching people that real strength wasn't in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to keep building, even when everything tried to break you. His vulnerability had become his weapon. His struggle had become his sermon. And as more people began connecting with his story, a strange thing happened. The same critics who had questioned his motives were now confessing that his words had helped them through their own battles. By now, it was no longer just about a single message. It had turned into a movement. Pastors across the country started preaching about building and fighting. Churches began using the phrase as a declaration for their year. It was spreading fast, and no one could have predicted how far it would go next. By the time months had passed, Pastor Tolan Morgan's message had grown into something far greater than a single sermon. It had become a symbol, a call to rise, rebuild, and resist every force trying to break what God was building. You won't believe how many lives it had already touched. People across the world were using the phrase, "I'm building and fighting," as their daily reminder to stay strong. But behind all the inspiration, there was still an air of mystery. Some were convinced that this was more than ministry. It was a story of survival. And as more layers of the story unfolded, this is where it gets interesting. Sources close to the church revealed that Pastor Morgan had faced immense pressure during this period, pressure that could have easily silenced anyone else. Between leading his congregation, dealing with personal loss, and standing firm through criticism, it seemed like the weight never lifted. Let me tell you, what kept him going wasn't fame, followers, or applause. It was faith. Even when the world questioned his motives, he stayed quiet, letting his life and his preaching speak for him. He had once said, "You can't expect peace in a season of construction." And those words now felt like the story of his entire journey, a life spent building under fire. But here's the shocking part. The very battles that were meant to break him ended up shaping his legacy. People who once doubted his sincerity began seeing him differently. They saw a man who didn't just preach about endurance, he embodied it. Every trial became a testimony. Every wound became wisdom. And what makes this story different? Pastor Morgan never pretended to have it all together. He showed people that faith doesn't make you flawless, it makes you fearless. That honesty is what connected millions to his message. As 2025 continued, I'm Building and Fighting started echoing beyond the church walls. It appeared in podcasts, social media captions, and even motivational conferences. The message had transcended religion. It had become a lifestyle, a mindset for anyone facing opposition. People said Pastor Morgan had started a movement without even trying. And destiny took an unexpected turn when global ministries started reaching out to him, calling his sermon a prophetic word for a weary generation. What began as a single sermon in Georgia had become a worldwide rallying cry. Still, behind all the public success, there was something profoundly human about Pastor Morgan's story. He had shown that even spiritual leaders face exhaustion, doubt, and discouragement. But instead of hiding it, he turned his struggle into strength. The craziest part, the more he opened up, the more people believed again, not just in God, but in hope itself. Because in him, they saw proof that broken people can still build, and tired warriors can still fight. And as the story came full circle, Pastor Morgan stood once again on that same pulpit, looking over his congregation with that same fire in his eyes. This time, his voice was steady, his heart lighter, but his message even stronger. He said, "I'm not just building and fighting for myself anymore. I'm building and fighting for everyone who ever felt like giving up." The crowd erupted, tears flowed, because they knew this wasn't the end of a sermon, it was the start of a legacy. What began as controversy ended in clarity. What began as whispers ended in worship. Pastor Tolan Morgan's story wasn't about fame, it was about faith under fire, and how one message can turn a man's struggle into the world's strength. Because sometimes the battles we fight in silence become the voices that heal nations. And as 2025 moved forward, one thing became clear. He wasn't just building a church. He was building believers who knew how to fight back,